February 1943. The scorched dunes of Tunisia were a graveyard of smoking steel and broken dreams. At the Kasserine Pass, the air thick with the metallic tang of burnt oil and the sulphurous stench of spent shells, the legendary desert fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, stood amidst the wreckage of the United States Army's first major entry into the European theater. To the casual observer, it was a German masterpiece. The Americans had been routed, their green, untested units shattered. By the veteran precision of the Afrika Korps, thousands of young men from places like Iowa and Pennsylvania were now heading to prisoner-of-war camps, while their equipment lay scattered across the desert floor like discarded toys. But as Rommel walked through the smoldering remains of an American tank park, he didn't feel the surge of triumph that had defined his earlier campaigns in France or at Tobruk. Instead, he felt a cold, creeping sense of existential dread. He reached down and picked up a tin of rations found in a half-buried American ruck. It wasn't just food, it was luxury. White bread, high-quality chocolate, cigarettes, and fresh coffee. He looked at the boots on the fallen soldiers, better leather and better stitching than anything his own men had seen in years. He looked at the abandoned trucks and realized they didn't just have hundreds, they had thousands, and each one was brand new. Rommel looked up at his staff, his eyes weary under
the brim of his famous goggles, and voiced a truth that would eventually shatter the confidence of the Third Reich. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just defeated an army, he had encountered a tidal wave of industrial fury. He saw that while the Germans were fighting a war of brilliance and maneuver, the Americans were fighting a war of math, and the math was stacked against Germany.
Before the dust settled at Kasserine, Rommel was the untouchable icon of the Wehrmacht. He was the man who had turned the North African desert into his personal chessboard, consistently defeating British forces that had greater numbers and shorter supply lines. To the German High Command, the American entry into the war was a punchline. Hitler had famously dismissed Americans as a soft, decadent people, more interested in jazz and movies than the harsh realities of the battlefield. The German soldiers shared this arrogance, believing the Amis were hobbyists who would fold the moment they tasted the Schwerpunkt of a veteran panzer division. And at the Kasserine Pass, the initial results seemed to prove them right. The American troops were indeed green. They were led by overconfident officers who didn't understand the geography and lacked the combat cohesion of the men who had been fighting since 1939. When the panzers struck, the Americans retreated in chaos. It was a disaster that cost the U.S. more than 6,000 casualties and hundreds of tanks. On paper, it was Rommel's last great tactical victory. But the Desert Fox was a realist in a world of fanatics. He watched how the Americans reacted to their defeat. He noticed that instead of collapsing, the Americans adapted with a terrifying speed. He saw that their artillery wasn't just support, it was a devastating, centralized force of nature. In the German army, a soldier would call for artillery and wait. The Americans, however, had perfected a system called time on target. Within minutes of an American observer spotting a German unit, shells from multiple batteries miles apart would all land on the exact same spot at the exact same second. It was a symphony of destruction that Rommel had never witnessed before. As the battle raged, Rommel began to track the arrival of American reinforcements. In the German experience, replacing a lost tank or a destroyed battalion was a matter of weeks, involving complex logistics and struggling rail lines. But in Tunisia, Rommel watched as the Americans replaced entire armored divisions in a matter of days. He realized the Atlantic Ocean wasn't a barrier, it was a conveyor belt. He saw the American M3 half-tracks and the M4 Shermans appearing in numbers that defied logic. He looked at his own dwindling supplies, his exhausted men, and his patched-up tanks, and then he looked at the horizon, where the American line seemed to grow stronger every time he hit it. He told his staff that the Americans possessed an extraordinary sense for the practical and the technical. He marveled at how they didn't just fight, they engineered victory. They built roads where there were none, They landed thousands of tons of supplies on open beaches, and they possessed a mobility that made the German Blitzkrieg look stationary. The most terrifying realization, however, was the air power. Rommel had once dominated the skies with the Luftwaffe, but now the sky belonged to the P-40 Warhawks and the P-38 Lightnings. He watched his supply columns being shredded from the air with surgical precision. He realized that the American pilot wasn't just a warrior. He was part of a system that ensured no German move went unpunished. To Rommel, the American industrial machine was like a giant waking up and realizing its own strength. He knew that even if he killed 10 Americans for every one German, the Americans would simply send 20 more, while Germany had no one left to send. The quote that Rommel delivered to his staff after Kasserine Pass was not just a military report, it was a prophecy. He said, "The Americans have learned a great deal since Tunisia. They are extraordinarily adaptable. Their material is miles ahead of ours. If this is the quality of material they can bring to bear, we are facing an enemy of unlimited resources." To his inner circle, he was even more blunt. He remarked that winning a battle against such an enemy was a temporary distraction from an inevitable conclusion. He saw the sheer weight of American steel as a force that no amount of German tactical genius could overcome. He noted that while the German soldier was perhaps the best individual fighter in the world, the American soldier was backed by a civilization that had turned the production of war into a factory science. This was the moment the myth of German invincibility died for Rommel. He saw that the Americans were learning from their mistakes at a rate that made them a different army every month. The men he fought at Kasserine were amateurs. The men he would face later in Sicily were veterans, and the men he would meet in Normandy would be the masters of the battlefield. Rommel understood that the American ability to absorb a loss, learn from it, and return with 10 times the force was the most dangerous weapon in the history of warfare. When Rommel finally returned to Europe to report to Berlin, he found a leadership in denial. Hitler and Göring refused to listen to his warnings about American industrial capacity. They mocked his concerns about air power, insisting that the German spirit would always triumph over American numbers. But Rommel had seen the truth in the dirt of Tunisia. He knew that the war had become a battle of attrition that Germany could never win. He predicted that once the Americans reached their full production capacity, the Luftwaffe would be swept from the sky, the U-boats would be hunted to extinction, and the Atlantic Wall would be pulverized by a weight of metal that Germany couldn't even imagine. His words were dismissed as defeatism, but every month that followed proved him right. From the beaches of Sicily to the hedgerows of France, the American learning curve and the relentless output of Detroit and Pittsburgh became the defining factors of the conflict. Rommel's tactical victory at Kasserine Pass became a footnote in history, while the American reaction to that defeat became the blueprint for global dominance.
Today, the lesson of Kasserine Pass and Rommel's dread remains more relevant than ever. It serves as a reminder that first battles are rarely the final word. The true strength of a nation or an army isn't found in its ability to avoid a setback, but in its capacity to adapt, outproduce, and out-evolve its opponent. Rommel saw the American spirit not in their initial tactical blunders, but in the speed with which they turned a disaster into a masterclass in logistics and firepower. He realized that in modern war, the factory is as important as the foxhole. As we look back on the Desert Fox's realization, we see the foundation of the modern world. The Americans at Kasserine were defeated by a man of genius, but in that defeat, they showed the world that they were a people of unlimited resolve and unparalleled resources. Rommel's warning to Hitler was the sound of the clock ticking for the Third Reich. He was the first to understand that the Americans hadn't just come to fight, they had come to win, no matter the cost, and they brought the entire weight of their civilization with them. The Kasserine Pass was the end of the beginning, the moment where the tactical brilliance of the past met the industrial reality of the future. Rommel saw it, he feared it, and in the end he was destroyed by it. The story of Rommel and the Americans is a testament to the fact that when a great power learns from its failures,
it becomes an unstoppable force. It is a lesson written in the sands of Tunisia and echoed through the halls of history. What Rommel witnessed at Kasserine was the birth of the American way of war. It wasn't about the individual heroics of a single sniper or the brilliance of a lone commander. It was about the crushing synchronization of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power, all fed by a logistics tale that stretched halfway around the globe. He marveled at how an American private could call for fire and receive a rain of steel that would have required a German colonel's permission. He saw the democratization of lethality. He recognized that the Americans had taken the German concept of Blitzkrieg and industrialized it, making it faster, heavier, and impossible to stop. This was the terror of the Desert Fox. He saw his own mirror image, but larger, stronger, and backed by a supply of fuel and ammunition that never ran dry. For Rommel, the war became a countdown. He spent the rest of his life trying to find a way to stop a wave that he knew, deep down, would eventually wash over the heart of Germany. His realization at Kasserine Pass remains one of the most poignant moments of the war, the moment the hunter realized he had become the prey. The Desert Fox was out of tricks, and the American giant was just getting started. This transition from tactical supremacy to strategic obsolescence is the great tragedy of Rommel's career. He was a master of a dying art, facing the architects of a new era. At Kasserine, the past met the future, and the future was wearing a U.S. Army uniform.